This one's a little bit spontaneous, but I think it's important. I think that in any war, the media finds itself in a very challenging position. And by media, I am talking in collective terms here. Not that every outlet has the same editorial direction, they obviously don't, but I think every media outlet finds itself in a difficult position, unless that is they are the mouthpiece of a totalitarian regime and there is no objectivity. For example, Russia Today. I don't think it's a credible news source because it is basically an organ of the Russian regime. Not even a state broadcaster, it's an organ directly of the Russian regime. But that's neither here nor there. This video isn't really about RT. If we look at what's happening in the Holy Land right now, and I use Holy Land or Near East as a kind of neutral term for the geography, I could say Israel, but I think it's going to encompass a wider implications. It's going to, expand beyond that. Um, it's a classic example of a war through media in some ways. This can be traced back. I mean, journalists have always been in war zones, but where there was a particular situation of wars being fought on social media, perhaps the first big example was the Georgia War of 2008. And then we saw it throughout the hellish years of the Syria War, Ukraine, and now Israel and Palestine. There's other examples, but those ones particularly come to mind. Probably Armenia and Azerbaijan as well, the flare up earlier this year. But very few conflicts in the world, if any, are as polarizing as the long running conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. Believe it or not, it's not actually the world's longest running conflict. There are some low level insurgencies that have been going on even longer. But it does nevertheless rank as one of the world's longest running and most deeply ingrained conflicts. I haven't watched the news honestly in the last couple of days, which is very depressing what's going on out there. I'll just quickly say my own stance as it stands at this point. I still maintain my absolute belief that Israel has a right to defend itself, but I think there is a humanitarian crisis in Gaza that can't be denied. I think Hamas is largely responsible for it, for igniting this war. They didn't even do it out of free Palestine. They done it over their stated reason was the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem. So they've ignited this war. They knew Israel would respond robustly, and it has. But I don't see any military strategy in not letting humanitarian supplies get in. Now, I'm not talking about. I understand there are some things that Hamas can use, but there's really no reason for Israel to stop medicine, for example, getting in. No reason at all. And I think Victoria Derbyshire asked Mark Regev, the spokesman for Netanyahu, yesterday, you've had a lot of sympathy, but isn't there a risk that some of the sympathy will be lost? I actually think the strategy that Israel is taking is total war. I think they see this as a battle for survival, and it's basically gloves are off. Whatever problems are faced by the other side, it's their problem. I think that's the strategy Israel's taking. Um, and there is an argument to be made why should Israel kind of consider the welfare of, frankly, its enemies? The problem is it is ordinary Palestinians suffering horrendously, along with ordinary Israelis who are fleeing from rocket attacks. In fact, James Cleverly himself, the foreign secretary, was caught up in a drill in an air raid. And he pointed out this is something Israelis have to put up with all the time. I think, sorry, I'm interrupting myself here, but I think people look at this and they say, oh, Israel's this kind of wealthy state, it's full of security, and they finally know what it's like. That's not true, because Israelis are constantly facing the threat of rocket attacks. And the only reason we don't see mass casualties, as we've seen in southern Israel recently, is because for the most part the Iron Dome has been successful. Make no mistake, Hamas and other such groups want the complete annihilation of Israel. So if they were given half a chance, there would be thousands and thousands and thousands of Israelis slaughtered. This is not hyperbole, it's a stated goal. Now, when you're living next to an enemy with that mindset, the idea that the Israelis should be moderate is absurd. But I do think that they have to understand the court of public opinion is not a trivial thing, and if they're not letting aid get in, that's wrong. Um, you know, I'm I'm as troubled by images of Palestinian children under rubble as I am with Israeli children slaughtered in their own homes. It's a child is a child. That's just a no-brainer. But I do think, unquestionably, this is a war that's been started by Hamas, and I hope that Israel takes them out once and for all. And I think that is their goal. I know that top military brass here have warned the Israelis that this could be a trap, this incursion into Gaza. I imagine it could bog down to a sort of guerrilla war that could take months, maybe even years. And no doubt there'll be very, very heavy military losses on the Israeli side, even with their equipment, even with them being a modern army, being basically in the lion's den. Um, I have a lot of sympathy for young Israeli soldiers in that situation. Um, because Hamas don't give a damn about civilians, they hide behind them. That's how terrorists operate. But anyway, I want to touch on a particular issue, which is the media role. To come back to that, I honestly think this is a situation where the media can't win, and I'm talking here about media outlets that pretend to be somewhat neutral or impartial. The problem is, the BBC got very heavy criticism for its use of terrorists, and I stand by what I said. I am also very critical of that. I remain critical. I don't unsay anything I've said. I think they're contradicting their own stance because they're arguing that terrorist is an emotive term. Um, that ignores the fact that it actually has a legal basis. It's not just an emotive term, it has a legal basis. And their own guidelines in 2021 said due impartiality does not mean absolute neutrality. In other words, to show impartiality doesn't mean you have to just be 50-50. And I think when covering terrorist carnage, you can't rationally be 50-50. This is not just an emotive thing, it's just a matter of truth. Hamas is a terrorist organization and is designated as such, not just by Western governments, in fact, by many Arab governments. Um, so the notion that it's just an emotive thing, I think the BBC is dead wrong about this. And I think they're arrogant. It's kind of we know best, even though it's highly controversial. I think they're being stubborn, like, oh, look how brave we are standing our ground. No, it's just stubborn and it's not actually particularly intelligent because the insinuation the term doesn't have a meaning. It sort of implies the term isn't valid. Well, why is that not valid, but militant is? Militant also has meaning. So I think the BBC is dead wrong about that. But ironically, I've seen allegations both ways. Well, Western media is biased towards Israel. That's a big claim coming from the pro-Palestinian side and their supporters. I think it's fair to say that on the streets, unfortunately, the weight of protest has been more towards the Palestinians. But I'm not sure if that necessarily reflects public opinion. I think it's just that the pro-Palestinian people are well organized and they're very vocal. But unquestionably, there are Hamas supporters among them, and that makes me want to throw up. I think in this country, given that Hamas is designated a terror organization, they should anyone showing open support to them should be treated as a terrorist sympathizer. I think the police should be seen to be acting, and it is repugnant that Jewish people are feeling genuine fear for their safety. The synagogues have to be protected. There was vandalism at Golders Green Cemetery. Um, this reiterates that Israel is in a unique position. It's the only Jewish state. So people who wonder why Israel's responding so robustly, I do think it's important to consider the position that they're in. Not only have they faced the worst ever terror attack, this is a question of their very existence. Now, I defy any nation in the world not to hit back hard when their very existence is under threat. But anyway, I digress. On the media front, a few days ago, the BBC headquarters was hit with red paint. And for once, it wasn't just Stop Oil, it was pro-Palestinian people alleging bias towards Israel. But I've seen a few people claim that there's a bias towards the Palestinians and the BBC has an anti-Jewish, anti-Israel agenda. That's nonsense. I don't accept that. Notwithstanding the controversy over the use of terrorists, the fact of the matter is, and this is something that on that thread with John Simpson, someone pointed out, If it wasn't for the BBC's reporting or CNN's reporting, or in fact, I think it was Simpson himself said this, or other outlets, people wouldn't even know about what happened in Israel. Maybe you'd have people on the ground who'd be putting it on social media, but reported in a wide way. So people saying that the BBC is anti-Semitic, I'm sorry, I don't accept that, because we wouldn't even know about the Hamas atrocities if it wasn't for them reporting it. So that contradicts that claim. Um, and I don't think that reporting from the Gaza side equates to anti-Israel. That is a point about journalists doing their job, reporting what is happening on the ground as it happens. This idea that if they report from the Gaza side, if they report about the humanitarian situation there, it's somehow anti-Israel is absurd. That really is absurd. Um, so I think this is a situation where the media is going to condemn no matter what it does. If it reports from the Israel side, then they're pro-Israel. They've got a pro-Israel agenda. If it reports from Gaza, or well, they're shaming Israel, or they've got a pro-Palestinian agenda. The truth of the matter is, in a war, it is important to report from both sides as as best as possible. That isn't always practical, incidentally. And another thing is people forget the restrictions that journalists have. I mean, I've raised the issue, why is it some conflicts get more attention than others? There's some wars raging in Africa right now that even surpass this in terms of mortality. And look at what's happening in Haiti. That's, that gang warfare has now become, or arguably full grown war in Haiti because the security situation is so bad. So why are journalists not reporting from there? The simple reality is too damn dangerous. Journalists, frontline journalists, are brave people. They risk danger all the time, but there's no point in being reckless about it. In a situation where they can almost definitely be killed, then the report doesn't get out anyway. Or you get other situations where you have totalitarian states that don't allow reporting. I've heard, Chinese nationalists complain about biased Western media, oh, they're only showing the bad side. But the problem is the Chinese state, as an example, heavily controls what can be reported. So you can't blame media outlets for only showing a certain percentage of what's going on if they're restricted in doing so. This is something that people don't realize. There are heavy restrictions on journalists around the world. That's why I think a group like Reporters Without Borders is a very noble group. I have a lot of respect with what they do. Um, the media does not always get it right. I think the BBC is just plain wrong not to use the term terrorist because it's a legally defined term. Um, but other than that, I don't think it's fair to say that they're anti-Israel. It's I don't think there's any evidence for that. They have been interviewing Israelis. They've been reporting on the rockets. They've reported on the tunnels. They've reported on the atrocities. What else can they do? I mean, do people expect them to have an Israeli flag in the background or something? It's just that's not how journalism works in any context. So I think that's a very unfair criticism. And as for the pro-Palestinian people who say it's pro-Israel, they have reported from the Gaza side. They have reported about civilians dying there. But the fact of the matter with this conflict is that it's a war that was triggered by Hamas. Anyway, I'll leave it there. But yeah, I think like this sort of situation, honestly, the media is going to be condemned no matter what it does. So what they have to do is be consistent. If there's particular public criticism, maybe they should take it on board and not be so dogmatic. Because if they're not trusted, this question of trust is very important. If people do believe that there's an agenda and they're doing nothing to persuade people otherwise, then they're jeopardizing their own trust. So I do think they should reevaluate their policies on the term terrorist regarding Hamas, because what Hamas has done absolutely fits the definition of terrorist. And the BBC says, oh, we're letting people make their own mind up. Well, actually, you're taking a position. They can't say it's neutrality, because I think that when you take so-called neutrality in the face of terrorist outrage, it is taking a position. So they can't say that's due impartiality, because it actually isn't. Of course, if they use the term terrorist, that would be taking a position as well. But to most people, it is the correct position. Let me know your thoughts.